The untold fate of noblewomen after Viking conquests.
Longships cut through the waves, hulls burned in fire, and kings fell to Viking steel. But in the ashes of conquest, another story began. The story of noblewomen, torn from their homes, bound in chains, yet carrying a strength no sword could break. This is not the saga of warriors, but of those history tried to silence. A tale of survival, loss, and defiance. The untold fate of women after Viking conquests. They were the silent spoils of war. When Viking longships struck like lightning, they left behind not only burning halls and fallen kings, but broken destinies. Noble women, daughters of lords, queens in their own right, wives of proud warriors, found their fates rewritten in blood and fire. Some were carried across the sea as ransoms, their worth measured in silver. Others were bound in chains, forced into lives of servitude beneath the very men who had shattered their world. A few vanished from history altogether, their names lost like whispers swallowed by the wind. Yet not all bowed to despair. Some endured, shaping survival into power. Some rose, against all odds, to carve their mark in the sagas, though their voices were seldom heard. Among them was one such woman. Her name was Elswyn. She had been born to an English alderman, raised in a hall where firelight glowed against tapestries of saints and kings. She knew the soft crackle of hearth flames, the weight of velvet, the solemn murmur of monks reading scripture. She had known safety and pride and the love of a family. But on one night soaked in blood and smoke, the sea kings came, their dragon-proud ships carved into the riverbank like blades. Warriors stormed her hall, their cries rising above the clash of iron. Her husband fell with a blade through his chest. Her child was torn from her arms. The walls that had once sheltered her cracked and roared with fire until they collapsed into embers. Elswyn was bound in chains and dragged to the shore, her world reduced to ash. The sea took her next. The dragon ship rose and fell on black waters, cutting its way through the storm. Rain lashed her face. Salt stung her lips. Thunder rolled like drums of war. She was lashed to the mast, her silken gown now heavy with seawater, her skin bruised from the ropes that bit into her flesh. The Northmen roared their chants, heaving at the oars as the waves threatened to devour them. Grief gnawed at her bones. Rage seared her heart. Yet beneath the storm of sorrow, a whisper stirred. I will not vanish. I will not become a nameless spoil in their saga. The sea itself seemed to test her vow. Waves rose like mountains, hurling the ship into dark abysses. Lightning split the sky, carving faces of fury into the night. The men bellowed their oaths to Odin and Thor, their voices lost to the roar of the storm. And it was then, in the chaos of sea and thunder, that Elswyn first saw her ally. She was unlike the others, a woman among the raiders, her hair braided with beads, her eyes sharp as winter fire. She moved with the calm of someone unafraid of death, unshaken by storm or blood. Astrid, a shield-maiden. While others mocked Elswyn's sobs, Astrid did not. She loosened the ropes that cut her skin. She pressed a horn of water to her lips. And though Elswyn could not yet understand her words, the tone was unmistakable, not cruelty, but a vow of survival. The storm raged through the night, but Elswyn endured, and with Astrid's shadow beside her, fragile and uncertain though it was, her story, like so many forgotten fates of noblewomen after conquest, had only just begun. The storm gave way to dawn. When the longships finally slipped into the embrace of a northern fjord, the sea lay calm, but the land that rose before them was colder and harsher than anything Elswyn had ever known. Mountains stood like jagged teeth against the sky. Dark forests crept down their slopes, cloaked in mist. This was no land of velvet halls or gilded saints. This was the north, raw, unforgiving, and older than memory. Dragged ashore, Elswyn was marched to a great hall of timber. Smoke curled from its roof, the scent of pine and roasted boar thick in the air. Men crowded inside, their laughter loud, their drinking horns overflowing. Shields hung upon the walls, their surfaces scarred by battle. She was shoved forward until she knelt at the foot of the high seat, where a jarl sat with eyes as cold as iron. He studied her not as a woman, but as treasure. In his gaze, her fate was already sealed. Ransom or bondage, survival or ruin. For days she lived in chains, a prize on display among men who measured wealth not in scripture or crowns, but in silver, cattle, and slaves. Yet chains could not bind the spirit. Elswyn watched. She listened. She began to piece together fragments of their language, the rhythm of their feasts, the rivalries that burned beneath their laughter. Astrid lingered always at the edge of her vision, sometimes silent, sometimes near, her presence a shield without words. When men jeered, Astrid's glance silenced them. When despair threatened to hollow Elswyn, Astrid would whisper in her tongue, offering strength that needed no translation. But the North was not a land of peace. One night, as fire roared on the hearth and the halls shook with drunken song, the doors crashed open. Rival warriors flooded in, their axes gleaming red in the firelight. The clash was instant, savage. Arrows split the smoke. Blades rang like thunder against shields. Elswyn, still chained, pressed herself against the wall as men fell screaming. The mead spilled across the floor, mixing with blood. A raider's shadow fell upon her. His blade rose. She seized the chance. Her fingers closed around a fallen dagger, slick with blood. It was clumsy, desperate. Yet when she struck, the steel found its mark. The man collapsed at her feet, his roar cut short. For the first time since her hall had burned, Elswyn's voice returned, not in prayer, but in defiance. The Jarl laughed at the sight, a harsh roar of approval. The men shouted, half in shock, half in awe. In that moment, Elswyn ceased to be only a captive. She became something else, a woman no longer unseen, a piece upon the board of their brutal world. But victory carried its shadow. The rival Jarls withdrew into the night with oaths of vengeance. Blood feuds had been born, and blood feuds demanded repayment. Winter loomed on the horizon, sharp and merciless, ready to devour the weak. And Elswyn, caught between the ashes of her past and the peril of her future, felt the weight of a trial yet to come. When the snows fell, they did not fall softly. They smothered the mountains in silence. The rivers froze until they gleamed like glass. Hunger crept through the villages, biting at bellies as fierce as wolves. Elswyn's hands, once pale with rings, blistered on axe handles as she split wood. She hauled water until her shoulders ached. She mended torn cloaks, her needle trembling in the cold. She tended fires that threatened to die with every breath of wind. And yet she endured. She listened to the sagas sung by firelight, voices rising into the rafters as snow beat against the hall. She learned of Odin, of Thor, of Freya. She saw how the people clung to honor as fiercely as she once clung to prayer. She came to understand that survival in this land was not a gift, but a war fought every day against the elements, against rivals, against despair itself. And slowly, against all she had ever believed, a change began. The noblewoman, who had been taken in fire, was no longer only a captive. She was becoming something else, someone forged in hardship, someone the North itself was shaping. And through it all, Astrid remained, a shadow, a guide, a flame of strength in the frozen dark. Sometimes her eyes betrayed secrets she did not yet speak. Sometimes her silence weighed heavier than the snow. But Elswyn felt it, the bond tightening between them, the sense that their fates were tangled together by threads neither could cut. The snows would melt, the rival Jarls would return, and when they did, Elswyn would have to decide not only how to survive, but who she was willing to become. The snows did not last forever. When spring thawed the fjords and the rivers broke their ice, the old feuds awoke with them. Word came on the wind. The rival Jarl was returning. His ships blackened the horizon, their prows cutting the waves like blades. War horns howled through the mountains, their echoes shaking the valley. The hall braced for slaughter. Men sharpened axes, women carried water. Children were hidden in the shadows of the woods. Elswyn, though still marked as an outsider, felt the tension bind her to them. She could no longer pretend she did not belong to this fate. Whether she wished it or not, the storm would break over her too. When the longships struck the shore, the clash was like thunder upon earth. Shields locked, spears flew like storms of iron. Arrows hissed through the air, finding flesh. Men fell, their cries swallowed by the roar of war. The fjord itself seemed to tremble under the fury. Astrid was at the front, her sword flashing like fire in the smoke. She fought not like a captive who had bent the knee, but like a storm given flesh, her braids flying as she carved a path through the invaders. Elswyn, though untrained in war, refused to cower. She carried water to the wounded, pressed cloth to bleeding wounds, dragged the fallen out of the flames. More than once, a blade came close. More than once, she lifted a shield that was not her own and braced herself against the strike. It was in the chaos that the truth was laid bare. Astrid's eyes met hers, and in that gaze was confession. She had once been as Elswyn was, stolen, bound, brought across the sea. But where Elswyn had resisted, Astrid had yielded. She had sworn herself to her captors, risen among them, carved her place with blade and oath. And now she urged Elswyn to do the same. Yield. Bend. Live. Power lies in survival, not in pride. The words struck deeper than any blade. Elswyn's heart thundered with rage and fear. Yield, and abandon the memory of her child, her hall, her blood? Or resist, and risk vanishing into death? A forgotten whisper in the saga of men? The battle pressed closer. The Jarl fell, his chest split by the enemy's axe. The hall burned, flames devouring the roof as beams crashed around them. Screams rose with the smoke. Amid the inferno, Elswyn stood with a dagger in her hand, Astrid before her, her voice fierce, urging surrender. But Elswyn felt the fire rise in her blood. She was not made for silence. She was not made for chains. She struck. The dagger tore across the throat of a rival warrior, saving not herself alone, but the wives, the children, the captives who cowered in the flames. Her cry rang out above the storm of war. A hall can burn, a bloodline can fall, but the spirit endures. The survivors rallied to her voice. The enemy faltered, broken by the fury of resistance. By dawn, the fjord was strewn with bodies, the ships burning as the tide pulled them back into the sea. When the smoke thinned, Elswyn stood bloodied but unbowed. She was no longer the noblewoman dragged in chains from her hall. She was no longer just a captive waiting for her ransom. She had become something else, a legend born in fire and iron, a voice that refused to be silenced. Astrid, wounded and weary, looked upon her not as spoil, not as rival, but as sister. Their bond, sealed in blood and defiance, would echo beyond that day, carried into the sagas of those who remembered not only kings and jarls, but the women who endured. The years turned, and the fjords whispered of battles past. Warriors' names were carved into stone, their deeds sung around fires, their victories etched into memory. But the women, the stolen, the silenced, the defiant, were left in shadows, their stories spoken only in hushed voices, if at all. Yet, like embers hidden beneath ash, their memory has never died. Elswyn was one of many. Her fate was not an exception, but a reflection of countless noble women whose lives were broken and reforged in the fires of conquest. Some bent and vanished into silence. Others rose, their courage unrecorded but no less real. History often remembers the clash of swords, the burning of halls, the victories of jarls and kings. But behind those sagas lies another truth, one that speaks of survival, resilience, and voices that refuse to be extinguished. And now, across the centuries, we uncover them, piece by piece, name by name, story by story, because the fate of noble women after the Viking conquests was not merely loss. It was transformation. It was endurance. It was defiance. Their voices deserve to be heard again. So as you leave this story, carry their memory with you. Share it, speak it, keep it alive. For history is not only the tale of men who wielded axes, it is also the untold saga of women who bore the weight of conquest, and yet, in silence or in fire, endured.